Today, we're tackling something really fundamental for any professional discipline, actually. How do you build genuine scientific rigor?
Right. And specifically, how do you do it from the inside? Not just borrowing tools from, say, psychology or sociology, which has often been the case.
Exactly. We're focusing on social work, a field that, according to our source material today, has faced this big challenge, epistemological fragmentation, they call it.
That's a key term. It means they've often relied heavily on these exogenous models, analytical frameworks from outside the discipline.
And the problem with that, I suppose, is that while borrowing is fine sometimes, over-reliance means the field struggles to define its own unique scientific contribution, its own identity.
Precisely. It leads to what the theory calls theoretical subordination. If you're always using someone else's measuring stick, it's hard to prove your own specific value.
Okay, so that sets the stage. The solution we're digging into today is this really ambitious framework by Jalin Simonovic-Manaras, the Cognosystemic Theory of Human Psychosocial Relational Construction. Let's just call it the TCCR, right?
Yes, TCCR is much easier, and it really is this original architecture. It's designed specifically to overcome that subordination, to give social work its own theoretical engine.
It blends different approaches, systemic, narrative, cognitive, but it carves out something unique at its core.
That's right. The core concept is the Cognosystem. You can think of that as the central object of study for the TCCR.
So for you listening, the Cognosystem, how should we picture that? Is it like a shared mental map?
You could think of it that way. It's described as the intersubjective narrative matrix. Basically, the web of shared stories, meanings, assumptions, rules, all the things that construct our social reality.
And it operates across different levels of society.
Yes, crucially, from the individual level right up to broad societal narratives. The TCCR sees reality as constructed by these narratives, and it provides a framework not just to understand them, but to deliberately transform them.
Okay, so if the theory tells us what reality is made of these narrative systems and how to change it, then where do today's focus, the internal validity criteria, fit in?
They're the methodological heart. They are the standard for proving that an intervention within the TCCR framework actually worked, that the change was real, appropriate, and critically auditable.
Auditable from within its own system, not using external benchmarking.
Exactly. Endogenous validation. These criteria are designed to be the rigorous quality standards that turn everyday social work practice into, the source calls it a controlled theoretical laboratory.
That sounds like a huge step up in terms of accountability. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack these criteria.
That's the plan. We need to look at the three main criteria: coherence, effectiveness, and justice. And also the tools, the instruments they use to measure these things.
And then there's this validation matrix at the end, which sounds pretty intense.
It is. It ties everything together and enforces that rigor. So let's get into how this whole system works.
Okay, let's start with the bedrock, the Cognosystem itself. To really get why these criteria are needed, we need a clearer picture of this narrative supersystem. What's it made of?
Right. So at its core, the Cognosystem is this complex network of what the TCCR calls narrative systems. Think of these as nodes or clusters of dynamic sociocultural meaning.
Dynamic meaning they change.
Yes, they're not static. They're described as open, constantly self-regulating systems. They have their own internal logic, feedback loops. It's quite sophisticated.
And to make this manageable for a practitioner, the TCCR breaks down any single narrative system into specific components.
Exactly. There are 8 core analytical elements. This is how you move from just talking about stories to doing a structured analysis. It provides a common language.
Okay, let's walk through them. How would a social worker actually observe these 8 elements in, say, a family or an organization?
Well, it follows a kind of analytical chain. First, you always start with the experience, the raw event, the situation, the input that kicks things off.
Like someone losing their job. That's the experience.
Precisely. Then come the immediate filters. Perceptions and emotions. How does that person or the system around them initially react? Fear, anger, relief, maybe?
Yeah.
That's the effective cognitive response.
Got it. Experience triggers perception, emotion. Then what?
Then you have to ground it in context. Where and when did this happen? What's the surrounding situation? The job loss example, was it during a recession? Was the person close to retirement? Context matters hugely.
Makes sense.
After context, the experience gets encoded into language, into the propositional content. This is the core statement, the what happened narrative. I was unfairly dismissed, or the company downsized.
Okay, that's the basic story. But people don't just state facts, they build arguments around them, right?
Exactly. Which brings us to the cognitive evaluation. This is the argumentative layer. It's where the justifications, the elaborations, the why behind the propositional content comes in. I was unfairly dismissed because my manager never liked me and they ignored my performance reviews.
Okay, so propositional content is the what, cognitive evaluation is the why or how.
Sort of, yeah. Then comes a really interesting one, the epistemic attitude. This is about the certainty attached to the narrative. Is this story held as absolute, unshakable truth? Or is it seen as one possible interpretation, a working hypothesis?
That sounds subtle. How do you separate epistemic attitude from the cognitive evaluation in practice? Don't they overlap?
They definitely overlap, but the distinction is critical for intervention. Cognitive evaluation looks at the content of the arguments. Epistemic attitude looks at the stance towards those arguments.
Have you given an example?
Sure. Imagine two people who share the same basic story, propositional content and reasons, cognitive evaluation, about why a community project failed. But one person holds this view with absolute certainty, high epistemic attitude, blaming one specific group, very resistant to any other information.
Right, dogmatic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The other person might have the same evaluation, but holds it more tentatively lower epistemic attitude. They might say, well, it seems like this was the main reason, but maybe other factors played a role. That difference in attitude drastically changes how you might intervene. Sometimes the first step isn't changing the story, but lowering the dogmatism.
I see. So it's about the flexibility or lack thereof. That makes a lot of sense. What are the last two elements?
The final two focus on intention and effect. First, the narrative purpose. Why is this story being told now by this person? What's the goal? Is it to seek sympathy, justify inaction, mobilize support?
The strategic angle?
Yes. And finally, the narrative function. What does this narrative actually do in the real world? How does it shape behavior, relationships, decisions? What are its tangible effects on lived experience? Analyzing all 8 gives the practitioner a really detailed map of any narrative system.
Okay, that's a very structured way to look at narratives.
Yeah.
But you said these systems operate across layers of society. How does the TCCR map that out?
Right. They don't exist in isolation.
Yeah.
The TCCR borrows heavily here from Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, but adapts it to focus on narrative and power dynamics across strata.
So like the nested dolls idea.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But importantly, these layers aren't just descriptive backdrops. They are seen as actively mediating symbolic power. They influence each other constantly.
Let's define those layers quickly as the TCCR uses them. Smallest first.
That's the microsystem. This is the immediate environment. Think individual narratives, self-esteem, personal goals, and immediate relationships, like family dynamics, close friendships. It's where you live day to day.
Okay, then the next layer up.
The mesosystem. This is where different microsystems interact. Think groups, communities, organizations, school policies affecting a family, workplace dynamics, local community narratives about safety or belonging. This is often where social work intervention happens most directly.
And then the bigger, maybe less visible forces.
Exactly. That's the exosystem.
Yeah.
These are broader structures that impact the mesosystem but might not involve the individual directly. Things like the local school board's policies, the parents' workplace roles, specific media outlets shaping local discourse, legal frameworks.
So things that affect your life, but you're not directly participating in their creation.
Right. And finally, the macro system. This is the big one. The overarching cultural blueprints, the dominant ideologies, the deep-seated societal norms and values, the hegemonic frameworks that define what's considered true or right or possible.
Wow. Okay, so you have these narrative systems structured into 8 elements operating across these 4 interconnected layers. That's the basic architecture. But what makes it change? What drives the dynamics? You mentioned hierarchy and frictions.
Yes. The TCCR emphasizes narrative hierarchy. Not all stories are equal. Some narratives are dominant, widely accepted, maybe even invisible because they're taken for granted hegemonic narratives. Others are marginalized, silenced, subjugated.
Like official histories versus personal accounts of the same event.
That's a great example. And when these different narratives clash, say, a person's micro-level experience of injustice bumps up against a meso-level institutional denial, or a macro-level narrative that says, that doesn't happen here, that creates tension.
And that tension is the friction.
Precisely. Frictions aren't necessarily bad. They're signals of misalignment. But they can generate crises. And crises, within this framework, are seen as opportunities. They activate processes of systemic reorganization. The professional's role isn't just to smooth things over, but to potentially guide that reorganization strategically.
Strategically. This brings us to the cognosystemic meme. Now, most people think of memes as funny internet pictures, maybe Richard Dawkins' idea of cultural replicators, but the TCCR uses it differently, right? More actively.
Very much so. The passive, viral idea view of memes isn't sufficient if you're trying to be an intentional agent of change. So, the TCCR defines the cognosystemic meme as a unit of narrative meaning that is strategically designed.
Designed by the practitioner.
Potentially, yes, or identified and amplified by them. The key is that it's deployed purposefully. It's intended to displace or reinforce or completely re-signify existing meanings within the cognosystem across those different layers.
So it's like a targeted narrative intervention, a conceptual tool.
Exactly. It's a vector for transformation, carefully crafted to shift the psychosocial architecture in a specific way. Think of it like introducing a new, potent piece of code into the system.
Okay, that is a powerful and potentially risky idea. If you're intentionally designing and deploying these memes to reshape social reality, the ethical bar and the need for proof must be incredibly high, which leads us directly to needing those internal validity criteria.
Absolutely. If you're going to engage in what you called intentional narrative surgery, you need an incredibly robust way to validate your actions and their effects using the system's own logic.
Right, so if you're deploying these strategic memes, you need proof it worked and proof it was the right thing to do. This is where the internal validity criteria come in as the TCCR's internal judge and jury.
Exactly. They function as the epistemic quality standards within the TCCR. They're the benchmark used to evaluate if a diagnosis, a decision, an intervention, like deploying a meme, is actually theoretically sound and practically valuable according to the TCCR itself, not some external theory.
So escaping that dependency on outside models we talked about earlier.
Precisely. And the overall goal here is twofold. First, it's about ensuring integrity, making sure everything connects logically across the micro, meso, and macro levels. No weird jumps in reasoning.
Okay, theoretical, practical integrity. What's the second goal?
The second goal is maybe even bigger for the discipline itself, generating accumulative endogenous knowledge, building social work's own evidence base from the inside out. And that relies entirely on strict traceability.
Traceability. You mentioned this earlier, turning every step into an observable record. Can you elaborate on how the TCCR formalizes that? It sounds demanding.
It is demanding. It mandates documenting the entire sequence for every cycle of work. You start with data. What verifiable observations, records, testimonies did you collect? Then how did you interpret that data using the TCCR framework? That's the meaning step, framing it in terms of narrative systems, frictions, hierarchies.
Okay, data leads to meaning.
Then, based on that meaning, what specific decision did you make? What intervention did you choose? Often this involves designing or selecting a specific mediation bridge, which we'll get to.
Right.
And finally, what was the measurable effect of that decision? What changed? What were the observable outcomes? This DMDE chain, data to meaning to decision to effect, has to be documented clearly. It's the audit trail.
That sounds incredibly rigorous. So if I'm a practitioner and I just have a gut feeling, oh, things seem better after that session, that's not enough.
Not nearly enough.
Yeah.
The gut feeling needs to be unpacked. What data supports things seem better? How does the TCCR interpret that data? Meaning, what specific action, decision led to this, and what are the concrete indicators of improvement? Effect.
How does this detailed process stop the practitioner from just seeing what they want to see? Confirmation bias, finding the meaning that fits their preferred decision.
That's a central challenge, and the criteria system is built to counteract it. The meaning step isn't arbitrary. It must be explicitly framed using TCCR concepts, the 8 elements, the layers, frictions, power dynamics. It forces the practitioner to show their work, to make their interpretive lens visible and defensible within the theory.
Okay, so the theory itself provides the structure for interpretation.
Yes, and if the link between any of those steps, DMDE, is weak or undocumented, the intervention fails the internal validity check later on. The validation matrix enforces this. It keeps the process honest.
Right, it forces transparency. Okay, so this rigorous traceability underpins everything. Now, let's introduce the 3 core criteria themselves. You said they operate as a system.
Yes, they're interconnected, and all 3 must be met for an intervention to be considered fully valid within the TCCR. They are:
inter-level coherence.
Making sure the plan makes sense across all layers.
Exactly. 2, relational effectiveness.
Did it actually create sustainable change in how people relate?
Precisely. And 3, relational justice.
Was the change achieved fairly, ensuring voices were heard and had influence?
Correct. You can't sacrifice one for the others. Achieving effectiveness without justice, for example, is seen as a fundamental failure within this ethical framework. They have to work together.
Okay, let's dive deep into criterion 1, interlevel coherence. We said it's about narrative and operational coupling across micro, meso, and macro. What does it look like when coherence breaks down? Give us a practical example.
A classic breakdown happens when, say, at the micro level, a family identifies feeling controlled and wanting more autonomy as their main issue. That's their narrative.
Okay.
But then the meso-level institution they're involved with, maybe a social service agency, has rigid protocols and interprets the family's desire for autonomy as resistance or non-compliance.
So, completely different interpretations of the same behavior.
Exactly. And worse, the macro-level policies might even reward stricter controls. So if a practitioner designs an intervention focused purely on fostering autonomy at the micro level without addressing the meso and macro contradictions,
is it doomed to fail?
It's going to crash against the institutional reality. The TCCR calls this making hermeneutical leaps. The interpretation or solution at one level just doesn't connect logically or practically with the others. It's incoherent.
So to avoid that crash, the TCCR uses this checklist, the 3 FITs, or 3F. These are the operational checks for consistency.
Yes, the 3F are like the quick diagnostic tool you apply before launching an intervention, often using the mapping tools we'll discuss. First is semantic fit.
Do we all mean the same thing when we use certain words?
Pretty much. Is the name of the problem and the proposed solution or hypothesis understood consistently across all relevant levels? If the family, micro, calls it lack of communication, and the agency, meso, logs it as parental deficit, you have a semantic gap. The intervention needs to bridge that language difference first.
Okay, clear language. What's the second fit?
Pragmatic fit. This is about feasibility. Do the rules, resources, roles, and procedures, especially at the meso level, actually allow or enable what's being agreed upon at the micro level?
So, if a team, micro, agrees on new collaborative workflow,
do the existing company policies, software systems, or reporting structures, meso, actually support that workflow, or do they block it? And do overarching regulations, micro, permit it? If the meso-macro levels don't enable the micro agreement, you have a pragmatic coherence failure. It's like saying yes in theory, but no in practice.
That sounds common. Okay, third fit.
Evaluative fit. This ties back to measurement and ensures you're measuring the same thing across levels. If your intervention aims to increase, say, mutual respect, microconcept, your meso-level indicators shouldn't just be about meeting attendance quotas.
Right. They need to actually reflect respect. Maybe changes in how decisions are recorded or feedback mechanisms.
Exactly. The indicators must measure the same underlying construct, respect, in this case demonstrating consistency between the stated goal, discourse, the actions taken, practice, and the measured result outcome.
Okay. Semantic, pragmatic, evaluative fit. That's the check. But managing this across layers seems complex. What tools does the TCCR provide to actually map this out and fix the gaps?
There are 3 key instruments mentioned. First, the Meaning Circulation Map, MCM. This is essentially a diagnostic diagram.
Like a flowchart for narratives.
Sort of, yeah. It visually maps how narratives, meanings, and power flow between the micro, meso, and macro levels related to the specific problem. You map out the nodes, the connections, the potential blockages, the frictions. You use the MCM before intervening to check the 3F and identify where coherence might break down.
So it makes the invisible power dynamics visible. Okay, once the MCM shows a gap, how do you bridge it?
That's where Mediation Bridges, MBs, come in. These are the practical tools, the interventions themselves, designed specifically to connect levels and translate agreements or meanings across them.
What forms can they take?
They need to be concrete and traceable. An MB could be documentary, like a new written protocol, a checklist, or formalized meeting minutes. It could be human, like designating a specific person as a liaison or mediator between a family and an institution. Or it could be ritual, like implementing a mandatory opening script for meetings that sets specific interaction norms.
Okay, so MBs are the specific actions taken to ensure coherence. And how is this all tracked?
Through the Cognosystemic Decision Chain, CDC. We mentioned this earlier, the DMDE record. This documentation has to be kept meticulously for each level and each intervention cycle.
And this CDC helps fight against, what was the term? Performatism.
Yes, performatism, basically, going through the motions without real substance or effect. If a team implements a new meeting ritual, an MB, but they don't document the data that showed the need for it, the specific decision to use that ritual, or the observable effects on meeting dynamics, then that ritual is just performative. It looks like action, but lacks documented purpose and outcome, so it would score low on coherence traceability.
Right. The CDC forces you to connect the dots. Let's make this concrete with the school case study from the source.
Yeah.
The problem was a gap between the school's official rules about participation, macro, and the chaotic reality of meetings, micro, where agreements got lost.
Correct. There was a clear friction there. The macro ideal wasn't translating downwards. The analysis identified a coherence gap, specifically in translating macro rules into consistent micro practice, and then back up into meso-level accountability.
So what mediation bridges did they use?
They implemented 3 MBs. MB1 was a formal meeting protocol, documentary bridge, outlining clear rules. MB2 was an opening script, ritual bridge, used at the start of each meeting, which explicitly included a cognosystemic meme. Clear agreement, clear respect.
That meme sounds like it's designed to directly target the observed problem, lack of clarity, and interruptions.
Precisely. It's a strategic narrative injection. But the crucial bridge for closing the coherence loop was MB3, public minutes.
Why were the public minutes so important?
Because they serve 2 key functions. First, by being formalized in public, documentary bridge, they took the often vague agreements made in the meeting, micro, and solidified them into a stable, reviewable, meso-level document. This addressed the lost agreements problem.
Okay, it created an institutional memory.
Exactly. Second, by making these minutes public and linked to the protocol, it ensured that the school's own macro-level regulations about participation and decision-making were now being demonstrably applied and monitored at the micro-meso interface. It closed the loop. Microagreements became meso records, ensuring macro rules were consistently enacted. This dramatically improved the coherence score because the intervention directly addressed the identified systemic gap in translation and formalization.
Okay, so we've ensured the intervention plan is coherent across levels using the 3F, MCM, and MBs, all tracked by the CDC. Now we need to know if it actually worked in a meaningful way. That brings us to criterion 2, relational effectiveness.
Right. And the key word here, as emphasized in the TCCR, is sustainably. Relational effectiveness isn't just about whether people felt better immediately after an intervention.
It's not about that workshop high that disappears the next week.
Exactly. It's about whether the intervention managed to reconfigure the patterns of interaction, the rules governing relationships, the actual architecture of the cognosystem in a way that endures.
How does the TCCR guard against mistaking temporary fixes for real change?
It insists on looking at the pattern level and across multiple system levels. For example, if a therapy intervention helps an individual manage their anger better, micro-level change, that's positive. But if the toxic workplace dynamics, meso-level, or cultural norms condoning aggression, macro-level, that contributed to the anger remain unchanged,
then the individual improvement is vulnerable. Fragile.
Precisely. The TCCR would classify that change as fragile and therefore low on relational effectiveness. True effectiveness requires institutionalizing the change, embedding it in the rules and structures at the meso or even macro level so the new pattern holds.
Okay, so effectiveness is about stable, patterned, multi-level change. How do they measure what needs to change? What are the key dimensions of a healthy relational architecture?
For this, the TCCR uses a set of 4 core dimensions, often remembered by the Spanish mnemonic ICR. These are the variables you target and measure for effectiveness.
Okay, let's break down ICR. What does each letter stand for?
First is I for integrity trust. This looks at predictability, reliability. Do people and systems follow through on commitments? Can you count on them? High integrity builds trust.
Makes sense. C.
C is for coordination. This is about the functional alignment of the system. Are tasks, roles, timelines, and information flowing smoothly? Are people working together effectively, or is it chaotic?
O.
O stands for recognition, reconocimiento in Spanish, hence the O sound link. This is about dignity and legitimacy. Are people treated with respect? Is their voice, their contribution acknowledged as valid within the system?
Oh.
R is for conflict resolution. Does the system have mechanisms for dealing with disagreements and frictions when they inevitably arise? And crucially, are these mechanisms actually used and effective, or do conflicts just fester?
Integrity, coordination, recognition, conflict resolution. ICR. So an effective intervention needs to demonstrably improve one or more of these dimensions in a stable way.
Yes. And you need to identify which ICR dimension is weakest or causing the friction, and then design your mediation bridges, MBs, specifically to target that dimension, measuring the change using clear indicators.
Can we use the work organization case study to see this in action? They had high turnover, conflict, a sense of mistreatment. Sounds like multiple ICR failures.
Definitely. The diagnosis pinpointed major deficits in trust integrity. People likely felt commitments weren't kept, contributing to mistreatment, and conflict resolution. Conflicts weren't being addressed effectively, leading to festering issues and turnover.
So previous attempts, like just talking more, were probably performative because they didn't target these structural ICR issues.
Exactly. The TCCR intervention instead focused on institutionalizing change at the meso level, using specific MBs designed to hit those ICR dimensions. MB1 was a safe reporting channel.
Aimed at rebuilding trust integrity by providing a secure way to face concerns.
Precisely. Anonymity guarantees were key here. MB2 directly tackled conflict resolution and coordination. It established a joint committee with very clear rules.
What made this committee different from just another committee?
The key was embedding accountability and coordination directly into its structure. It had clear procedures, defined roles, but most importantly, a mandatory service level agreement, SLA, of 10 business days for resolving reported conflicts.
The SLA. That takes it from a vague hope we should resolve things faster to a hard, measurable commitment.
Exactly. That 10-day SLA directly addressed the conflict resolution dimension by forcing timely action. And it boosted the trust integrity dimension because it created a predictable, accountable process. If the committee missed the SLA, that failure had to be documented in the CDC, triggering analysis of why the system failed. It prevents brushing delays under the carpet.
So it engineers accountability into the process. What were the results? Did it actually improve the ICR dimension?
Yes. Measurably. The average time to resolve conflicts plummeted from around 21 days, which is pretty dysfunctional, down to just 9 days, clearly hitting the SLA target. That's a huge jump in coordination and conflict resolution effectiveness.
Okay, that's a hard metric. What about the softer side, like recognition?
They measured that too. Employee perception of recognition, feeling heard and valued, was tracked using surveys, likely on a 1 to 5 scale or similar. It improved significantly from a baseline of 2.1, which is quite low, up to 3.6 after the new system was implemented and functioning.
So concrete changes in process led to measurable improvements in both efficiency and the relational climate. That demonstrates effectiveness.
Robust relational effectiveness, because the changes were embedded in the meso-level structure, the committee, the SLA, the reporting channel, and demonstrably shifted the ICR patterns.
But as you hinted, even this kind of effectiveness isn't enough on its own. The source warns about creating extractive systems if you ignore the third criterion.
Correct. You could, in theory, design a highly effective system, great coordination, fast conflict resolution that is profoundly unjust because it achieves this efficiency by silencing certain groups or steamrolling minority viewpoints. That leads us to relational justice.
Right, so relational justice acts as the ethical safeguard. Effectiveness gets things done, but justice asks how and for whom. How does the TCCR define justice in this context?
It goes way beyond just ticking a box for participation. It's defined as ensuring participation with consequences and operating under fair procedures. It's about the procedural and ethical integrity of the change process itself.
Participation with consequences, meaning people's input actually has to do something.
Precisely. It's not enough to let people speak. Their speech must have a demonstrable chance to influence the diagnosis, the decisions made, and the final outcomes. The core idea is that the Cognosystem, through the intervention, should actively work to redistribute voice and, crucially, influence.
Okay, so how is this measured? Is there another mnemonic like ICAR?
Yes, for relational justice, the TCCR uses the dimensions captured by the mnemonic VR, again, drawing from Spanish terms related to voice and influence.
Okay, let's unpack VR. What are the components?
First is V for voice. This is the basic capacity. Can people express themselves? Is there a space for them to speak and be heard within the decision-making process?
Seems fundamental.
It is, but it's insufficient on its own. The second, and arguably most critical dimension, is I for influence, from the Spanish incidencia. This measures the impact of that voice. To what degree does what people say actually shape the agenda, the analysis, the decisions taken, the final results?
So voice is being heard, influence is being heeded.
Excellent way to put it. Third is R for recognition. Similar to the ICR dimension, but here focused specifically on the procedural context. Are all participants acknowledged as legitimate stakeholders? Is their dignity respected throughout the process, even if there's disagreement?
And the E?
E stands for procedural equity. This is about the rules of the game itself. Are the procedures governing participation clear, transparent, consistently applied, and fair to everyone involved? Is there accountability if the rules are broken?
Voice, influence, recognition, equity. VIRE. It seems like influence is the one that really bites, the one that prevents tokenism.
Absolutely. And the TCCR framework has a specific, very strict operational rule designed explicitly to combat tokenism and ensure influence isn't just wishful thinking.
This sounds important. What's the rule?
The rule is stated quite starkly. If a voice enters the system, meaning someone speaks, makes a proposal, raises a concern, and it leaves no traceable record in subsequent agendas, meeting minutes, decision logs, or action plans, then relational justice for that cycle, specifically on the influence dimension, must be scored as 0.
0. So if someone speaks up and their point just vanishes into thin air with no documented follow-up or consideration.
Then from a relational justice perspective, their participation lacked genuine influence, and the system failed that check for that instance. It's a high bar for the practitioner. It forces them to actively design processes that don't just allow voice, but capture it and ensure it demonstrably enters the decision-making stream.
So you can't just have a consultation meeting and then ignore everything said. The process must show how input was considered, even if ultimately rejected with justification.
Exactly. It mandates mechanisms for ensuring influence, especially when dealing with pre-existing power imbalances.
What kinds of mechanisms or instruments are used to actively correct those imbalances and guarantee influence?
The source mentions several reparative measures, things like using a voice matrix during meetings to rigorously track who speaks, how often, on what topics, and whose suggestions make it onto the formal agenda.
Making the invisible patterns of dominance visible.
Yes. And then based on that data, you implement structural fixes, maybe establishing parity-based committees where different groups have equal voting power, or implementing rules like reserved seats for historically marginalized groups on decision-making bodies, or mandating rotation of spokespersons or facilitators to prevent the same few voices from dominating every time. Sometimes it also involves providing cultural or linguistic translation to ensure equitable understanding and expression.
These sound like concrete ways to re-engineer the power dynamics of participation. Let's look at the neighborhood case study. The problem was concentration of power. 80% of the agenda set by just 2 leaders. Lots of people might have had voice, but very little influence.
That's a perfect example of a VRE deficit, specifically in influence and likely procedural equity. The existing informal structure privileged a few voices.
So how did the TCCR intervention target VIRE?
They didn't just encourage more people to speak, they changed the structure. They established a formal neighborhood roundtable with a very clear, publicly shared script and defined roles addressing procedural equity.
Okay, clear rules. But how did they guarantee influence for new voices?
They implemented 2 key structural mechanisms: rotation of spokespersons for leading discussion on different agenda items, preventing the usual leaders from controlling every topic. And crucially, they established reserved slots, or seats, specifically for bringing forward proposals from individuals or groups who hadn't previously dominated the agenda.
So they literally engineered space for new voices to have guaranteed influence on the agenda itself.
Exactly. They didn't just hope for change, they built mechanisms to ensure it.
And what was the effect? Did it just make meetings longer, or did it actually shift the power dynamic?
The results showed a significant shift in influence. They measured the origin of agenda items. Before the intervention, 80% came from those 2 leaders. After implementing the roundtable with rotation and reserve slots, 45% of the agenda proposals came from new actors, people who previously had little to no influence.
That's a huge, measurable shift in who controls the conversation and the decisions.
It demonstrates a real increase in relational justice, specifically influence and procedural equity. The intervention didn't just make the process look fairer, it demonstrably redistributed the power to shape the community's direction. And according to the TCCR, without this kind of justice, any effectiveness achieved would likely just reinforce the old, unequal power structure.
Okay, we've explored the 3 crucial criteria. Coherence, does it line up? Effectiveness, does it create lasting change? And justice, is the change fair? We've seen the tools like MCMs and MBs. But how does a practitioner wrap this all together into a manageable, repeatable process?
That happens through the structure of the cycle. The cycle is the TCCR's standardized unit of work. Think of it as one complete iteration of the intervention process. It's not just defined by time. It's defined by achieving 8 specific verifiable milestones.
8 milestones. This structure is what allows for that cumulative endogenous learning you mentioned.
Exactly. Each completed cycle, properly documented, adds to the knowledge base. It makes the work systematic and comparable across different contexts or practitioners.
Can you highlight the milestones that really lock in the rigor we've been talking about?
Well, they all matter, but some key ones directly linked to the criteria. You start with clearly defining the cognosystem you're working with and establishing the baseline, measuring the initial state using I-Core-VR indicators. Then, critically, you must draft the hypothesis of change as a single, testable proposition.
Not just vague goals.
No, a specific prediction. Then you implement the designed mediation bridges, MBs, those concrete interventions. Milestone 6 is crucial. The meticulous documentation of the Cognosystemic Decision Chain, DMDE, for every significant decision, ensuring that traceability is maintained throughout.
Okay, so baseline, clear hypothesis, implement MBs, document the CDC, then comes the evaluation.
Yes. Milestone 7 is the application of the validation matrix. This is where the formal assessment against the 3 criteria happens. It's like the final quality control check for the cycle.
The validation matrix. You called it the dashboard earlier. How does it actually work? How does it operationalize coherence, effectiveness, and justice?
The matrix provides a structured way to score each of the 3 criteria, coherence, effectiveness, justice, by looking at them through 4 complementary dimensions. It forces a multifaceted evaluation.
4 dimensions for each criterion. What are they?
Okay, for each criterion you assess. 1, traceability. Was the DMDE chain complete and logically sound for this criterion? Is the evidence tray clear? 2, micro, meso, macro alignment. Did the intervention successfully link the different system levels as intended? Did the mediation bridges function correctly? Did it maintain the 3 fits? Semantic, pragmatic, evaluative. 3, suggested indicators. Were the predefined indicators related to ICOR for effectiveness, VIRE for justice, 3F for coherence actually met? Did the quantitative or qualitative data show the expected change? 4, observable effects. Beyond the specific indicators, what broader relational changes were actually observed in the system's functioning? What was the tangible impact?
So for coherence, you'd look at the CDC trace, the alignment across levels via MBs, whether the 3F held up as indicators, and the overall observed smoothness of operation. You do that for effectiveness and justice too, using their specific indicators, I-Core-VR.
Precisely. It ensures you're not just looking at outcomes, but also at the quality of the process, traceability, alignment.
Now, this leads us to what you call the brutally strict part, the strong minimum rule for calculating the final score. This sounds like where the TCCR really shows its teeth.
It absolutely is. It's formally known as the non-compensatory conjunctive rule, but weakest link principle captures it perfectly. It's designed specifically to prevent positive outcomes in one dimension from hiding or compensating for failures in another.
Okay, explain how it works. How is the final score for, say, effectiveness determined using these 4 dimensions?
The rule is simple but powerful. The final score for any given criterion, let's call it P, is equal to the minimum score achieved across those 4 dimensions. Traceability T, alignment A, indicators I, and effects E. So the formula is PNNT-AIE.
Minimum score. Let's walk through an example. Suppose I ran an intervention aimed at improving relational effectiveness. My observable effects, E, were fantastic, maybe a score of 4 out of 4. People are reporting much better relationships.
Okay, great outcome.
But my documentation was sloppy. My traceability T score is maybe a 2. And my alignment A across levels was a bit shaky, say another 2, because one of my mediation bridges didn't quite work as planned. My indicators, I were decent, say a 3. What's my final score for effectiveness?
Your final score for effectiveness is 2.
Even though the effects look great?
Even though the effects look great, the score is dragged down to the level of the weakest link in this case, the score of 2 for both traceability and alignment. The good effects cannot make up for the poor process integrity or weak structural linkage.
Wow. That really forces you to pay attention to the methodology, not just the end result. What does that score of 2 mean in practice?
It means the intervention is only considered partially valid for effectiveness. It signals that while there were positive signs, there are significant weaknesses in the process that undermine the reliability and likely the sustainability of those effects. The practitioner is then obligated, in the next cycle, to focus specifically on strengthening that traceability and alignment, fixing the documentation, redesigning the weak MB rather than just celebrating the apparent success or moving on to a new goal.
That is genuine endogenous rigor. It builds continuous improvement into the very structure of validation. The goal isn't just success, but provable, methodologically sound success.
Exactly. The whole point of the matrix and the strong minimum rule is to make the knowledge generated through practice auditable, comparable across different cases, and transferable. It moves social work practice away from reliance on intuition or borrowed frameworks and towards building its own robust, evidence-based disciplinary credibility grounded in its unique focus on narrative and relational dynamics. It gives practitioners a powerful way to justify their work based on internal standards.
So, reflecting on this whole deep dive, we've really journeyed from identifying a core problem in social work, that dependence on external validation, to exploring a comprehensive, internally consistent solution offered by the TCCR.
It's been quite a detailed exploration. We've seen how the TCCR defines its unique object of study, the Cognosystem, with its narrative layers and dynamics, and then crucially, how it builds its own methodology for validating change within that system.
The 3 internal validity criteria, coherence, effectiveness, and justice, really stand out as the pillars of this methodology. They demand alignment, sustainable change, and fairness.
And the instruments, the meaning circulation map, the mediation bridges, the Cognosystemic Decision Chain, they aren't just theoretical concepts. They are practical tools designed to make those criteria observable and measurable across the micro, meso, and macro levels.
And that validation matrix, particularly with the strong minimum rule, acts as the ultimate enforcer of rigor. It ensures that practitioners can't just focus on outcomes, but must demonstrate methodological integrity every step of the way.
It really pushes for continuous self-correction and learning, grounding professional action in verifiable, multi-scalar evidence. The TCCR, through these criteria, seems less like just another theory and more like a commitment to a fundamentally different way of practicing, one that's methodologically rigorous, deeply context-sensitive, ethically grounded, and aimed at genuine transformation.
It's about building that endogenous credibility, justifying action based on the specific reality of narrative construction and relational architecture.
Precisely. It empowers the discipline to define and defend its value on its own terms.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive. The TCCR presents a powerful lens, seeing society itself as a complex narrative construction.
And within that construction, it identifies these cognosystemic memes, strategically designed units of meaning as potential tools for deliberate transformation.
So the question to ponder is this. If you were to apply the same level of rigorous thinking demanded by the TCCR's internal validity criteria, ensuring coherence across levels, aiming for sustainable effectiveness, and demanding procedural justice,
what new meme, perhaps organizational, maybe political, maybe cultural, could you strategically design and introduce to challenge or shift a dominant, perhaps even harmful or extractive narrative currently operating in your own field, your community, or your organization? How could you use this level of rigor to engineer a more just and effective narrative reality?